Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Wednesday special. As it is the first special of the month, it is, of course, chosen by those kind of people over on Patreon. And so, in this particular instance, there was a tie in the vote. So, I guess I know what I'm doing for the next two specials. But anyway. So, this week's special is going to be a review of a book that I've been asked about a number of times, and, well, it's the book The World's Worst Warships by Anthony Preston. In that wonderful style of early 20th century and 19th century books, even though it's not actually such a book, it is actually published this millennium. It's also full-titled The Failures and Repercussions of Naval Design and Construction 1860 to the Present Day, but slightly less catchy than The World's Worst Warships. Now, this book is by Anthony Preston, and I want to preface all of this video by saying this is not intended to say that Anthony Preston doesn't know what he's talking about. That is far from the truth. He quite often does know what he's talking about, and he was a very, very well-respected naval historian. However, as you might guess from a review of the book called World's Worst Warships, there are some rather major differences of opinion when it comes to rating what is and isn't a world's terrible warship. And so I would humbly submit that even the best of us can be wrong at times. And yes, that does include myself. But what we're going to do is we're going to briefly go through the book. We're going to look at each of the ships or classes of ships that he rates as terrible. And then I'm going to say whether or not I agree with his assessment and why. Obviously, where we do agree, that section is going to be somewhat shorter. And I leave it up to you, my viewers, and those of you who may also be fellow naval historians, to take a view as to whether you think Anthony Preston was right, whether you think I'm right, or whether you think neither of us are right, and in fact the answer is somewhere else. So, with all that said, let's get on with the various ships and shipping in this book. Now, the first entry is the US monitors of the American Civil War period, and by that I don't mean the USS Monitor, I mean all of them. Now, some of you might be reaching for your rifles already, put them down. This is actually one I disagree on. His conclusions and criticisms of the monitors as a whole seem to rely mostly about the fact that their turrets were vulnerable to being jammed when being hit lower down, which is true, and also their rather poor record of seakeeping, with a number of them being lost to various reasons that are attributable to that. A couple of them obviously in storms, and a couple of them also to mines where they flooded very quickly and went over a lot faster than comparable displacement or sized conventional warships would have done. Now, all of these criticisms are relatively valid. However, to put them in a list of the world's worst warships, I don't think is entirely fair. Certainly there are certain US monitor designs which I definitely would put in that category, because some of them were truly abysmal. However, there are other aspects to his criticism that I don't think bear up. In his conclusion on the section, he makes a point that the Union Navy made an error trying to use monitors for missions outside their capabilities. Yes, this is true. However, the clue is right there. If the Union Navy is taking a ship that's designed for one thing and it tries to use it for a completely other purpose, the fact that the ship fails at that purpose is not the fault of the warship design itself. It's the fault of the Navy that's using it wrong. For the same reason, you might as well say that the Iowa class is a complete design failure because you can't take it over land and use it to shell Berlin. That's not a fault of the designer. That's the fault of whichever idiot decided they wanted to put a 45,000-ton battleship on tank treads and then discovered they couldn't. Now, with the turrets jamming, yes, that is a problem with the Ericsson-style turret, and yes, that is something that the various navies that had to drop contingency plans for possibly facing US monitors actually exploited ruthlessly in their preparation writings and drills. However, again, it has to be acknowledged that both the Ericsson and the Coles Patton turret were brand new technologies at the time. No one particularly understood how well they would work. Even their designers' own estimations on how they would work turned out generally to be completely wrong. So the fact that the turret could be jammed in that manner it's a design failing, but it's not necessarily something that merits the ship be and all the ships being stuck on the list of world's worst. The fact that you perhaps relied on a single turret and didn't have a second one for backup in case one jammed, that could be considered again a design failing. But once more, we have to look at what were the roles these warships were actually designed for. The Confederacy did not have a large ocean-going navy. The Union Navy, for most of the American Civil War, had to deal with riverine conflict and coastal blockade duty, with the occasional fight up and down rivers and in harbours. As such, you need a relatively small, shallow draft ship that's capable of navigating the US's quite confined and shallow waterways around rivers and harbours and the coast and such like, specifically because if you don't, you will not be able to go to the places that the enemy are. Because the Confederacy is building ironclads and being very much on the defensive, they also have no need of deep ocean going warships apart from raiders like CSS Alabama, and when they needed those, they built in two completely different designs to ships like the CSS Virginia. Now, with those restrictions on size, displacement, draft, etc., come obvious operational restrictions. They're not going to be as good at open ocean crossings as other nations' ironclads, such as Gloire or Warrior or Black Prince, are going to be. And that is not necessarily a design failing of the ships when the ships are not designed for that kind of combat. He also makes the point that against a stronger opposition with better industrial resources, more than four of them might have been lost. Again, very true. However, the Union Navy was not facing a stronger opponent with better industrial resources. They were facing the Confederacy, and the Confederacy were churning out shallow draft ironclads operating in close coastal waters, and the Union Navy had to respond to it. Now, yes, in theory, you could argue that the Union Navy would have put itself in a better position long term by trying to build something like at least La Gloire, if not Warrior, because I don't think US industry was quite up to matching Warrior at the time. And yes, US industry was capable of churning out some relatively decent small ironclads, looking at things like USS New Ironsides. But let's take a slightly closer look at USS New Ironsides briefly, while we compare it to monitors. Now, you can make an argument that USS New Ironsides is a far more capable design than pretty much any US monitor that was under construction or built, and you'd be right. However, a monitor, the average monitor, a coastal or riverine monitor of the US or Union, I suppose at the time, Navy, could be churned out in around about 6 months. The USS New Ironsides took nearly a year and a half to complete, and it was just over 4,000 tons. If you look at something along the size and shape of what the Union Navy would have had to build if they were thinking about fighting a big opponent like France or the UK, the British Empire, if you look at something like Warrior, even though British shipyards at the time were capable of churning out ships far faster than American shipyards, Warrior is still 2 years, roughly speaking, from ordering to commissioning into the Navy. And the Union Navy was not in a position where it could wait for a year and a half to 2 years to fill out its ironclads when the Confederate Navy was quite happy to build, again, smaller, less capable ironclads like Virginia and just take them out against wooden warships, because even those ships were still overkill for taking out wooden warships. So, again, the choice of a relatively small, not particularly ocean-going ironclad design was caused primarily in the Union Navy by the needs of war. They needed ships, they needed them quickly, the monitors filled the role. And so you can't really criticise the Union Navy for going, well, but what if we had to fight the British Empire? We should build ironclads to match them. Well, one, they couldn't, and two, even if they could, by the time they'd built a fleet of ocean-going monitors similar to ocean-going ironclad warships similar to HMS Warrior, the Confederate Navy would have broken their blockade with their own small ironclads. So again, strategic choice over tactical. Now, I do agree with his assessment that the monitor's reputation was inflated, as a lot of people do take some of the statements in the latter part of the 19th century by various US monitor captains, where they think they can sail across the ocean and destroy Royal Navy and French Navy and whoever else's Navy ironclads at face value. And yeah, that's not really true. But overall, the US monitors were ships that were built for a specific situation, and generally speaking, they did pretty well in those situations. Yes, they had design flaws, to be expected from a brand new class of warship built in a hurry during wartime. And yes, a few of the designs were utterly terrible, but I do not think that US monitors as a whole belong on a list of the world's worst warships, not by a long shot. The next ship in the book is the turret ship HMS Captain of the Royal Navy, and it will come as no surprise to those of you who are regular viewers of the channel that I thoroughly agree with him on this subject. The captain was an abysmal failure and almost a textbook example of how not to build a warship in any way, shape, or form. Everyone wanted nothing to do with it after it sank, and I've done a video on the subject, which link hopefully floating around somewhere right now, where I basically agree entirely with Anthony Preston's assessment. I will go so far, as I did in that video, to call it an ironclad failure rather than an actual ship. So yeah, we agree on that one. The next entry is the Popovs, the Admiral Popov and the Novgorod, the two Russian circular warships. Now, this I must disagree with him on. And again, video link appearing somewhere right now as I've already covered these ships. But in this particular case, I don't think our disagreement on this subject is necessarily to do with having differing views on the same information. More the fact that I think at the time of writing, when he wrote this entry, for I'm presuming probably lack of any better sources, he appears to have bought in to a certain degree to the kind of memes that went around for years and years about these ships, about how they were uncontrollable spinning tops, etc., etc. More research has come out since then, a good part of that being what I based my own video on. And so in this case, basically, the criticisms that he does bring up that are supported by current scholarship are still valid, but most of the criticisms he makes with regards to their ability to steer and their slow speed and such like, not they're not really supported by the current scholarship, but he couldn't have known that at the time because, well, it was in the past. And so I think we can safely agree to disagree on that, and I'm fairly confident in claiming that I'm probably right on this subject, and I'm fairly sure, given his assessment of the ships, that he would probably also change his view were he around to make an updated version of this book with the latest scholarship available. Next up, we have a double entry for the armoured rams HMS Polyphemus and USS Katahdin, I think. Katahdin, maybe? I don't know. Anyway, now in this case, I'm always slightly more sympathetic towards these particular ships because they were very much experiments, and as experiments, you have to be a little bit more forgiving of shortcomings as compared to, sort of, say, an incremental design on an existing type of ship, which then you would obviously be a lot more critical if they got horribly wrong. With that said, I think he, in his description of the ships, actually kind of counters his own argument as to why they supposedly count as the world's worst warships. And that is simply for the fact that when they were designed, certainly when HMS Polyphemus was designed, there appeared to be fairly strong evidence in the form of Virginia ramming USS Cumberland, and in terms of the Battle of Lissa, for ramming being a fairly modern and reasonable tactic. And the design of a ship armed with guns and some torpedo tubes and a ram, designed to run in at high speed, use very shaped angled armour to deflect shot and ram a ship and make it sink, again, it appeared to fit all the evidence. As it turned out, they were not perhaps the world's most successful ship, but again, it's a case of technology marches on. And in the late 19th century, technology was marching on at a very, very sharp pace. And Anthony Preston notes in his own section that the torpedo that Polyphemus was selected to be armed with was actually relatively slow, and that when she was designed, naval gunfire was also a relatively slow exercise, whereas by the time that she was properly in service, quick-firing guns had been developed, which made the whole concept of running into the enemy at very close range somewhat more problematic than it had been before. As well as that, machinery was advancing, and so, as designed, moving at 15 to 16 knots with a low profile, she would have been very fast. Again, by the time she came into service, more advanced machinery meant that actually this wasn't a particularly remarkable top speed. So, was she one of the world's worst warships? I don't think so, really. Yes, she was very rapidly overtaken by events, but again, people can't look into the future, and certainly not in the 19th century. Who knew what the next year was going to come up with? For the environment that she was designed in, and for the environment that everybody else could have possibly foreseen, her concept made sense and her abilities were fairly impressive. The fact that in the few years it took to go from concept to design to build to commissioning, everything had changed radically, does not, in my opinion, make her one of the world's worst warships. It just makes her a somewhat novel design that was rapidly overtaken by events. Otherwise, you might as well make an argument for, say, the Lord Nelson class pre-dreadnoughts to be one of the world's worst warships because they commissioned into an environment that was full of dreadnoughts. Is that their fault? No, they were designed perfectly in line with the cutting edge of pre-dreadnought technology at the time, and as pre-dreadnoughts, they were perfectly serviceable to the point that the Royal Navy actually thought that combined, the two ships might actually be able to take on a full dreadnought. They were very good warships, but they were just overtaken by events, and similarly, I think, with Polyphemus. Now, with the Katydin, things are a little bit harder to uh, justify. Katydin, in some ways, is actually superior to Polyphemus, although being constructed almost a decade after is not exactly surprising that it should be more capable. But as he notes in his own description, the US Navy was quite short on funds at the time, thanks to Congress, and was a little bit slow on the take up of new technologies in the very late part of the 19th century. And so, yeah, she was an improved version of the Polyphemus, but she was also an obsolete concept at the time of conception. So maybe you can make an argument for Katydin being one of the world's worst warships if you're looking at frontline navies, but as I say again, it was an experiment. It was an experimental ship that was built perhaps just a little bit too late. And again, it fulfilled its design criteria. The fact that its design criteria were not particularly relevant for the bulk of its service was not the fault of the ship. So I don't think they belong on world's worst warships. Perhaps if you were going to write a book about naval dead ends, they would definitely qualify for that, but not the worst warships in the world. They would have had a use at the time of their launch, even if it wasn't necessarily one they were originally thought for. Now we look at the Russian armoured cruiser Rurik. This one I'm a little confused as to why it's even on the list at all, because if you look through his own conclusion, it basically spends most of the conclusion arguing why Rurik shouldn't be dismissed as obsolete and shouldn't be called a failure, because she lived up to her designer's expectations as a gigantic armoured cruiser designed for commerce raiding. Most of his criticism basically seems to rotate around the Battle of Uslan in the Russo-Japanese War, where the Rurik was sunk in engagement with the Imperial Japanese Navy. But even so, he acknowledges that at that point she was obsolete, and yes, it might sound a bit odd for a ship that's only 14 to 15 years old to be considered obsolete, but again, end of the 19th century. It was very much true that a ship that had been built maybe to a slightly outdated concept of a massive single commerce raider 15 years before the outbreak of war was pretty much obsolete. And to be honest, when you've designed a ship as a gigantic commerce raider and then you take it into combat against ships that are designed to slug it out with each other, the fact that the Giant Commerce Raider is not necessarily the world's most effective warship, again, shouldn't come as a dramatic surprise. So I would tend to actually agree with his text, but not the inclusion of the ship in the book, because most of the text that he writes is actually basically arguing as to why it shouldn't be there, which is a bit odd, but there you go. Next is the so-called Dynamite cruiser USS Vesuvius, which weirdly enough doesn't actually merit the name Dynamite cruiser in the slightest, because there was no dynamite involved. For those of you who are unaware of this particular wonderful ship's design, the idea of this ship was to try and circumvent using black powder or gun cotton as explosive charges by effectively building a set of gigantic air rifles and firing shells filled with gun cotton using compressed air, which would cause a lot less of a sharp shock that explosive propellants did, and therefore be a lot less stressed. So there would be a lot less stress on the guns themselves, and had the added advantage of having virtually zero blast, no flash, and very little overpressure, which made things a lot safer and easier to operate, and also meant you could approach fairly stealthily at night. And firing at night would be, well, not entirely silent, but almost silent, definitely silent compared to a battleship's guns. And so this little cruiser was armed with 15-inch pneumatic guns. As I say, no dynamite involved, but I guess dynamite sounded more interesting at the time, so it got called a Dynamite cruiser and the name stuck. Anyways, this one I kind of agree in including it on a list of world's worst warships, primarily because the ship was designed almost entirely around the guns, and the guns themselves were near enough complete failures. This was because of two reasons. One was the fact they were fixed in place, and, well, the last, probably 50 years of gun technology development at that point had all been looking at about how to make guns more mobile and better able to be both trained and elevated, and now along comes a ship where you can neither train nor elevate the guns, you have to aim the entire ship. Unsurprisingly, this didn't do tremendous amounts for accuracy. The other thing was that the guns, because they couldn't train or elevate, had to rely for accuracy purely on varying the amount of pressure or the discharge time of the compressed air. And with the technology at the time, it wasn't really possible to regulate that anywhere near accurately enough to get consistent range, which meant that, well, in the wonderful world of Jeremy Clarkson, they were guns that could hit a target somewhere over there. And that was about the best you could hope for. There will be a video on this ship at some point soon, because it is quite interesting how they came up with the whole concept in the first place. But, as I say, it was a ship that was designed around a weapon system that wouldn't work, and any reasonable amount of testing beforehand would have pointed out that it wouldn't work and that the technology at the time wasn't capable of making it work. And for a ship that's defined, its existence is entirely defined by its weapon system, and that weapon system being a complete failure, yeah, I think this one is fair to include on a list of world's worst warships. That's not to discredit the appearance of the ship. It was a very interesting ship, but it was pretty terrible as a warship. Now we move on to the subject of the protected cruisers, powerful and terrible, built by the Royal Navy. Now, in this case, I somewhat agree and somewhat disagree with Mr. Preston's approach, and that's because when it comes to world's worst warships, I personally tend to divide it down two lines. You've got world's worst warships in terms of use and world's worst warships in terms of actual design, i.e. are they a terrible ship in and of themselves? And when I say use, I don't mean use as in what kind of use would they put to, because as we've already discussed, you can't predict what the Navy's going to do with any given particular type of ship. However, if a ship is put to the use that it's designed for and it's actually not very good at it, even if the ship itself is otherwise sound, then it's a pretty bad ship. So, yeah, that's my personal categorization of things. Now, in terms of the powerful class cruisers, they were designed, ironically enough, as a direct counter to another ship that we've already discussed, which was the Rurik, the Russian armored cruiser. And as a result, they were huge, very fast, fairly well protected, as protected cruisers go. They weren't particularly heavily armed for their size, although they were fairly heavily armed for protected cruisers of the time. They just happened to be very big. So, with that said, as he points out in his book, yes, they probably can be considered to be failures from the perspective of that they are an example of how not to build a navy, which was to build specific ships to counter specific enemy vessels. Because let's face it, even if you're the dominant power, as the Royal Navy was then and as the US Navy is now, if you start building specific classes of ship to counter very specific enemy vessels or small classes of enemy vessels, you end up with a complete mess of a hodgepodge of very, very expensive warships that are designed to do everything an enemy warship can do and a lot better, and you have to build more of them. So yes, from that perspective, they are very definitely they are kind of the epitome of that complete folly of naval design and usage. On the other hand, as warships, as cruisers, once the initial teething troubles of some of their more advanced machinery had been sorted out, they weren't actually bad ships. They were fast, they were well protected, as I said, they were reasonably well armed, they had a very high freeboard, they even looked pretty good, and they could serve the role of a cruiser very well. They were hideously expensive to run and far, far too big, but that was an artifact of their design to counter the Rurik and not any particular criticism of the ship in operation. So, yes, this one I'm 50-50 on. As a warship themselves, for the period that they were designed in, they were pretty decent ships. As a concept, they were utterly, utterly terrible. So, take it or leave it with that one. Now, we're almost out of the 19th century and entering the 20th century with the Borodino class battleships of the Imperial Russian Navy. And you may recognize these ships from such wonderful things as the voyage of the Second Pacific Squadron, so you might be able to tell where this is going already. Yeah, these were not particularly lucky ships. Out of the five of them were lost in action, and the fifth basically was not lost largely because it managed to avoid being in the same place as the rest of them at the time. So, yeah. Now, this one I kind of disagree with including them on the list, although they did have their flaws, and some of those flaws were quite considerable. Most of their inclusion seems to just center around the fact that four of them either went to the bottom or were captured at the Battle of Tsushima. And for those of you who've seen the video on the Russian Second Pacific Squadron, or Second Pacific Fleet, again, link appearing above, hopefully. Yeah, it's kind of understandable why they didn't do particularly well at the time. Yes, they had weaknesses in their armor layout. Yes, they were horribly overloaded by the time they got to the battle, and to be honest, by the time the Russians had finished building them. And yes, they had this tumble home design that the French loved, but was not particularly suitable, as it turned out, for actually making sure your ship didn't roll over and sink the minute it started taking on water. So, they had all these weaknesses, but these weaknesses were present in a lot of pre-dreadnoughts at the time. Obviously, the tumble home was present on French pre-dreadnoughts and to a certain extent early German pre-dreadnoughts. So that's not exactly a uniquely terrible feature. Having far too many secondary and tertiary guns too high in the ship and thus needing loads of protection, again, a very common feature on pre-dreadnoughts. The fact that they're in such a terrible state and got shot to pieces at Tsushima is more to do with the quality of their crews and the massive voyage they'd done than anything else. Again, the video on the Second Pacific Squadron kind of covers that in a fair bit of detail. And at the same time, the one ship that wasn't sunk straight off, the Slava, you may remember that ship from various tales told during various videos I've done. That ship actually ended up taking on and doing pretty well against German dreadnoughts in the Baltic during the First World War. Now, whether you want to count that as a absolute mark of terribleness against German dreadnoughts or an absolute mark of preeminence on the behalf of the Slava, kind of take your pick. However, the Slava was clearly no pushover and was clearly not a terrible warship. Although, fair enough, they had had another decade to work out the kinks in the design. So, as far as the Borodino class are concerned, they certainly had one of the worst outcomes for a warship class, but rating them as the exemplar of the worst warship for the, I guess, for the pre-dreadnought battleships, I think is quite unfair, considering that, well, I can definitely put you to a lot worse in terms of pre-dreadnought design, and as I say, when they were actually called to perform in an environment that wasn't the Second Pacific Fleet, the One Survivor did very good credit for itself. So, yeah, disagree on having this one included. If you're going to stick a pre-dreadnought in, stick the unnameable French one in if you're going to do anything else. That thing's just an abomination unto mankind. And now we have the Royal Navy's HMS Swift. We're now fully into the 20th century. HMS Swift was an ambitious try, shall we say, and it shall come as no surprise that this was at Admiral Fisher's behest, to create a destroyer, well, for lack of a better term, a dreadnought destroyer. Bear in mind, this is a period when destroyers are usually measured in the displacement of hundreds of tons. And along comes the Swift, which eventually clocks in, believe it or not, at over 2,000 tons displacement. So yes, this is a destroyer in the mid-1900s that displaces more than practically any destroyer built for the next 15 to 20 years. I mean, this is a displacement that wouldn't be out of place on a relatively large Second World War destroyer. And the sum total of its armament is 4 4-inch guns, which was replicated on a number of destroyers considerably smaller than it, a grand total of 2 torpedo tubes, so it was underarmed torpedo-wise compared to ships much smaller than it. And what did we get for this? Well, we got a speed of 35 knots, which was impressive for a 1900s era destroyer, where most of them were moving at sort of the mid to high 20s. But yeah, for a displacement and a bill that was kind of 3 to 4 times that of contemporary destroyers, it was definitely not worth it. And, well, things only got worse in the fact that it was so large that in the middle of the First World War, they took off two of the 4-inch guns and stuck a 6-inch gun on the front. So yes, we had a destroyer with a 6-inch gun, which promptly then blinded its own bridge crew when it fired due to massive muzzle flash at close range. Yeah, brilliant one there. It did have a relatively exciting time fighting a bunch of German destroyers and getting the best of them, but that was more skill of the crew than the ship's own capability, shall we say. And even so, it was damaged quite rapidly, as everybody who'd used the ship previously had predicted, because it was so overpowered with the engines necessary to propel it to that ridiculous speed that there were steam lines very close to the top of the ship, and they were exposed and open to damage very easily. So yes, you can kind of see where it was going with it, but it was a leap, not a leap too far, it was more of a let's stick the design in a trebuchet and catapult it beyond the line marked too far. It was not a practical design, to the point that even though it failed its design specs quite abysmally, the Admiralty agreed to limit the fines to the manufacturer, because basically Admiral Fisher had asked for the impossible. And so yeah, this definitely belongs in a category of one of the worst warships to be set afloat. Yeah. And now we look at our first dreadnought battleship, the Viribus Unitis class, or what many of you will probably know as the Tegetthoff class, Austria-Hungary's only actually constructed class of dreadnought battleships. Now, as some of you will know from, again, the review I've done of the Tegetthoff class, I have something of a soft spot for these ships, but it cannot be denied that they were pretty terrible in service in a lot of respects. Unfortunately, a lot of that can be traced to the Svent Istvan, which was built in a Hungarian yard because of the need to make the Austro-Hungarian Navy an equal share between Austrian and Hungarian shipyards, and that shipyard had no business building a battleship at all, and it showed in the way that that ship was completed. Some of their somewhat lackluster performances can be put down basically to the situation Austria-Hungary found itself in during the First World War, but there were quite a number of design failings as well. It's fair to say that a good number of these were actually, because in some ways they were a little bit of a step too far at the time. They introduced some rather radical and important innovations, such as the first successful implementation of triple turrets on a dreadnought battleship, for which they deserve rightful praise. But a lot of the rest of the implementation, well, as I've said before, if you gave the design of these ships to a British shipyard, an American shipyard, or a German shipyard, or maybe even a French shipyard, although that might be pushing your luck a little bit at this time, they would have come out a lot better. As designed, the ships did not have anywhere near the number of deficiencies that they actually came out with, but they were built with those deficiencies and suffered as a result of it. So, yeah, I mean, there were some inbuilt things that no good shipyard could really have fixed, like the significant lack of underwater protection because of the constraints on size that were put on them in the design phase. But they'd hardly be the only warships with, especially even dreadnought battleships, with relatively poor internal protection against underwater explosions. The loss of HMS Audacious being a good example of that, albeit that some of that failure was caused by people's failure to adhere to actual policy and procedure, but the less said the better. So, yeah, with this one, I'm forced to agree. This is actually that as built, they are not particularly good warships, although I still do stick by my opinion that as designed, if they'd been built by a good shipyard, they would have had a lot less failings and probably would have been in the upper third of dreadnought designs for their period. And now we move on to, ironically enough, a class of ship that was never actually completed, and you might think that's a little bit unfair. We're looking at the Normandy class dreadnoughts of the French Navy, or the Marine Nationale. Yeah, fair enough, one of them was actually completed. It was turned into an aircraft carrier, and yes, the burn is pretty much an example of how not to aircraft carrier. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the design of the ships as actual battleships. Now, in this category, I'm going to disagree again, partly with their inclusion. The Normandy design, as originally put down at the time that they were put under construction in 1913, isn't actually a terrible one. You're talking about a ship that's contemporary with something like the USS Nevada, the HMS Queen Elizabeth, ships like that. So, on that basis, the quadruple turret's actually quite an advancement, and the armament of their 12, 13 point something caliber weapons, 340mm guns, is not bad. Other than that, they are not at all terrible ships in terms of that period of dreadnoughts. Maybe their sidearm was a little bit on the thin side, but it's not, again, not terrible for the period. Where most of his criticism resides is actually around the absolute cavalcade of failure and hilarity that is the French Navy's attempt to design warships by committee during the 1900s and the 1910s, and, well, the fact that the Normandies weren't even completed because they were laid down late compared to when they should have been, and then there was the whole dragged out period of the First World War, in a lot of ways is attributable to that. But if you wanted to make a book about world's worst warship design committee, then certainly the people who were responsible for the Normandies would probably get first place on that and maybe take second and third place just by sheer magnitude of the terribleness of the French attempt to design warships by general consensus, which characterized this period. But again, trying to make the warship responsible for the human failures of its designers when the design itself was actually sound, it was just the process that was utterly awful. I don't think these ships deserve to be on the list. It's also kind of cheating in the fact that, apart from Bern, they weren't built. Oh, if you want to make again a list of possibly say world's worst aircraft carriers, oh boy, does Bern take that with it. It takes the biscuit, the cake, and the cup of tea at the same time. Um, but the entry is not about the Normandy class as aircraft carriers. That's kind of a side note. It's about the Normandy class of ships, and I cannot really agree with including the Normandy design in the list of world's worst warships. There were certainly worse dreadnoughts around at the time, and there were certainly worse dreadnoughts being designed at the time as well. So, yeah, I'm going to disagree on this one on purely the categorization of the actual warship. And now we have the first submarine on the list, the AA class fleet submarines of the US Navy. As it may come as zero surprise given the description, these were designed as very large fleet-capable submarines, kind of like the US equivalent theory as, say, the K class in the Royal Navy. So these were submarines that were designed to have very high surface speed, in the AA class's case, 20 knots, and to therefore be able to operate with the fleet, which was a little bit more realistic given the fact that the standard class had a maximum speed of 21 knots. They achieved their speeds, and few minor design changes were made for their surface armament, so they had a single 4-inch gun eventually fitted rather than two 3-inch guns, and they had some trainable torpedoes, which was quite nice. As unusually for a submarine, they were equipped with 4 fixed bow torpedo tubes and a pair of twin launchers on deck. So kind of like a destroyer in a way, I guess. Anyway, they didn't last very long because of technology overtaking them. And like the K class in the Royal Navy, they were pretty slow to dive, which is a pretty bad feature in a submarine, to be honest. Not the world's most agile, particularly difficult to handle, and like the K-class, again, had a tendency to bury their bows in the ocean. Now, with the K-class, that was solved to a certain degree by the introduction of a rather absurdly large blister on the top of the nose, which has some aesthetic appeal to some slightly deviant naval designers, but with the AA class, they just tried to increase buoyant space up front to not particularly great effect. They were very short-lived, starting life in 1916 and 1917, commissioning in the early 20s, and basically gotten rid of by 1930, although they were actually decommissioned in the early 1920s because they weren't actually particularly useful. So, sort of a couple of years in active service. Yes, in a way, they could probably they earned the entry here as in the world's worst warships because, as for their role, they were actually pretty terrible. But this, again, is more of a failure of the fleet submarine concept in that period. It's a flawed concept, and people went a little bit too far down the line trying to make it work. So, yes, for their failings and for their very short service career, I think you can make a fairly good argument for these things being included on the list of world's worst warships. On the other hand, if you're going to pick a single example, I don't think these are the fleet submarines I would stick in. I'd stick the K class in, and he has later down the line, so we'll get to that in a minute. So yeah, purely from a objective standpoint, you could probably justify these ships being in there. but if you want an example of the class, probably not the worst pick. And now we look at another grouping of classes, in this case the flush-decker destroyers of the US Navy of the First World War. Here is going to be another area of fundamental disagreement in a similar way to the monitors of the American Civil War at the beginning. Now, yes, you can make an argument some of the early flush deckers designed and built by the US Navy in what were actually the first years of the First World War for the rest of the world, but for the US Navy was kind of the build up to its involvement, were perhaps somewhat flawed in their implementation. Definitely, you can make that argument quite safely. However, to include all flush deck destroyers, including the Wicks and Clemson classes, no. The Clemson class in particular, by the end of the First World War, albeit that not that many of them were completed in time for the end of the First World War, but late 1910s, early 1920s, for that period, they were actually pretty much in the upper end of destroyer designs. They were fairly well armed, albeit that their main gun armament was not the most efficient of layouts. They had a lot of torpedoes, again, although with wing-mounted torpedo tubes, not making the most efficient use of space, but they were fast, they were long range, and for all that, their torpedo armament per broadside was comparable to a lot of other destroyers. So, and they could obviously do that twice just by turning around. Yeah, okay, you could make an argument that gun armament with the second and third guns on the wings was not the most inspired of layouts, but you can poke at various flaws in immediate post-war destroyer designs in all navies and come up with something. So I tend to rate the Clemsons fairly highly. Most of the criticism listed in the book is to do with quality of work from various yards, but hey, if you're going to suddenly crash build a ton of destroyers, you're going to expect a few yards to be slightly less good at building them than others. Now, yeah, a lot of what then goes on to be criticised is their service in the Second World War, and I don't think that's a valid criticism. These ships were not designed to serve in the Second World War. They were not designed to serve 20 plus years after they were constructed. They were designed for service in the First World War, and then to obviously contend with their immediate contemporaries. And in that respect, I think, let's say, possibly gun armament aside, they would have done pretty well in that respect. They showed a great ability to adapt to change, with various Clemsons being completed with 4 single 5-inch guns instead of 4-inch guns, and a couple of them even being completed with doubles, giving them a total of 8 guns or a 6-gun broadside. So there was certainly a lot of capability in the hull for the time period. And the fact that they were even able to serve at all in the Second World War, albeit largely in convoy escort and other reduced roles, is actually a fairly good mark in their favour. The fact that they weren't able to fight front line with destroyers in the Second World War is not a tremendous mark against them. And yes, let's say that there were things they could have changed. But given that the US Navy had been starved for funds for cruisers or destroyers for a fairly long time by Congress, the fact that they were able to come up with something like the Wicks and the Clemsons almost at the drop of a hat, when they suddenly had the floodgates of funding open to them, is actually it's definitely not a bad effort. As I say, I rate them pretty highly for the 1910s and early 1920s destroyer designs. So I think sticking the flush deckers in as a whole and then criticising them largely on the basis of some of the very earliest class variants and the fact that, oh wow, 25 years after the fact they weren't necessarily top of the line is thoroughly unfair, and they don't deserve to be on this list. And now we move on to, as mentioned before, the other fleet submarine design on here, the K class. And, well, yeah, well, pretty much what we discussed in talking about the AA class, the K class exemplify even more. Yes, they're faster than the AA class. They're also powered by steam. Yes, they have a pretty nasty main armament. And yes, when used exactly as designed, and when on a good day when they have time to run with the fleet and then submerge and set themselves in place as kind of a mobile minefield, yes, the concept of a fleet submarine kind of can be made to work, and in certain circumstances of First World War possibly could be made to work. And if it did work, it would be very devastating for the enemy. But as experience would show, in practice, in peacetime, no. And rapid advance of technology and the concept as a whole just not quite being mature. No. They were failures. Quite definitely, like the AA fleet class for the US Navy. For the as the book mentions, it would be spectacular to think what would have happened if half dozen K class had been waiting off the Horns Reef for the high seas fleet with their ridiculous torpedo salvos, but they weren't, and they didn't, and so many of them were lost or badly damaged in various trials and such that, yeah, I agree they're not particularly well represented in the field of submarine design, and so their inclusion along with the AA class in World's Worst Warships is probably justified, albeit that I would probably suggest you need to pick one or the other, because it's mostly a failure of design of the concept at the time given the technology, and less so I would say the designers trying to do their level best with what limited technological resources they had. And the last of the entries we're going to look at in this week's entry, because next week's entry, we'll do part 2 of this, and we'll include the other video that was tied in the Patreon requests. The last one we're going to look at is Courageous, Glorious, and Furious, or should we say Spurious, Curious, and Outrageous, the light battle cruisers. It should come as relatively little surprise to anybody that I agree fairly wholeheartedly with this entry. Yeah, as it turned out, they were superbly placed for conversion into carriers, but that was definitely not what they were designed for originally. They were designed as kind of a fast ocean-going monitor type support vessel for the grand idea of the Baltic project. But no, they well, actually, as covered in the dry dock episode that immediately precedes this, have a look at that entry when talking about the Baltic project, just to see what I think exactly of these ships. As designed, they rank amongst the most abysmal failures, and an example of probably why Fisher at this point needed a few medications that he wouldn't have taken anyway, but there you go. It's difficult to think of anything complimentary to say about this design aside from two things. One was, as I said, as it turned out, they actually made relatively good carriers for the period, and secondly, well, thanks to them, there were some spare 15-inch gun turrets laying around, which later on gave us HMS Vanguard, which was quite a nice battleship later on. So, yeah, apart from that, thoroughly agree, these ships definitely deserve a ranking on World's Worst Warships, and that is pretty much that for them. So we've got to about halfway in the book, and hopefully, as you can see, there's a number of points where I agree with this book. There's certainly a number of points where I severely disagree with this book, and there's a number of points where I can see the argument one way or the other, and I think it's more about criticising the concept than the actual ships themselves. Let me know what you think below in the comments below of this particular format. It has been requested by the Patreon, so they ask, I supply. But we will move on next week, starting with HMS Hood, and won't that be a little bit of a doozy of a back and forth between his points and my views on that particular warship. But we shall see where else that particular rabbit hole takes us next week. As I say, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.